Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning. And welcome to this event organised by the European Public Health Alliance, by EPHA. We're here to launch a new study that aims to answer a simple question. What is the healthiest alternative to diesel road vehicles? So some of you may know that the European Parliament has voted to end the sale of new diesel and petrol vehicles by 2035. And this week, the European Council has endorsed the principle. However, the European Commission has yet again delayed publishing new emission standards called EU7. These emission standards have the potential to accelerate the transition away from diesel. And indeed, a group of NGOs, including EPHA, have written today to the European Commission, calling for these standards to be published next month, as every month that new emission standards are delayed, 1 million more polluting cars are added to the EU's roads. So in this context, today, we're asking what the healthiest replacement for diesel is and what is needed to accelerate the transition. So my name's Richard Doughty. I'm an independent policy and communications consultant for public interest organisations, and I will be moderating today's event. We have participants joining from across Europe today. We're really happy to have you all with us. In a moment, we're going to hear from EPHA's Director General, we'll hear from the author of the study, and we'll have some other excellent speakers. But first, I want you to know how you can get the most out of this event. So this event is being recorded. The video will be available afterwards on EPHA's YouTube channel and EPHA's webpage. There will be lots of opportunities for you to share questions with our speakers. And you will see at the bottom of your Zoom window that there is a question box where you can put those in. We will also be updating the event page on EPHA's website with a copy of the study and of today's presentation. And we are live tweeting today's event from EPHA's Twitter account, which is at EPHA_EU, at EPHA EU. And you can join the discussion using the hashtag #CleanAir4All. So we have some great speakers today. In a moment, we will hear from EPHA's Director General, Dr. Milka Sokolović, and we'll have a special contribution from MEP and member of the European Parliament's Environment and Public Health Committee, Sara Cerdas. Then we will hear from Anko Hohn, who is the senior researcher with CE Delft, and he will introduce the main findings of the study being launched today. And then we will have a panel discussion with contributions from experts and specialists who will help us put this study in context. And that includes Professor in Environmental Epidemiology, Sara Anderson, the Chair of Eurocity's Working Group on Zero Emission Mobility, Ian Catlow, Emissions Engineer for the organisation Transport and Environment, Anna Krasinska, and the Director of Leading Knowledge and Innovation Centre, ELAD, Onof Karon. But first, I'd like to get us going with introducing EPHA's Director General to begin our discussion. Milka Sokolović joined the European Public Health Alliance as Director General last year, having previously worked as Head of Food and Health Science for the European Food Information Council and as Director of the Advanced Leadership Programme for the European Nutrition Leadership Programme. She's also been a postdoctoral fellow in medicine for Amsterdam's University Medical Center. Milka, really delighted to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining this EPHA's event today. For those of you who have not attended one of our events before, we work in the area of policy and advocacy, covering a broad range of public health topics. What sets us apart from other European public health NGOs is our membership and our audiences. We are happy to say that we are people's platform for public health with a broad and versatile membership of over 70, from European umbrella organizations to the smallest of grassroots. Our membership includes health professionals and patient organizations on the one hand, public health authorities and research organizations on the other, but most importantly, it includes those that represent vulnerable population groups. Among other topics, we focus on the intersection between social and environmental determinants of health, including the interplay between air pollution and health inequalities. Air pollution, as many of us will be aware, is the #1 environmental risk factor with a disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups, which is why we must raise awareness of it. In 2019, air pollution is estimated to have contributed to 6.7 million deaths globally. And the same year in EU, according to the European Environment Agency, above 300,000 premature deaths were attributed to chronic exposure to fine particulate matter with a diameter smaller than 2.5 micrometers or PM2.5, with road transport being the third largest source of PM2.5 exposure. More than 40,000 premature deaths were attributed to chronic nitrogen dioxide exposure, of which road transport is the largest source, and almost 17,000 premature deaths were attributed to acute ozone exposure. And these three pollutants are largely produced by internal combustion engines from road transport. Now, as public health organization, we focus on root causes, and air pollution is a key example of an environmental risk factor where individual level changes are either unavailable or inefficient. And that's what makes a coordinated action essential. And that is why EPHA is, for instance, supporting a campaign called Medics for Clean Air that helps healthcare professionals to speak out about the public health emergency caused by air pollution in Europe. And just so you know, this is a European coalition of doctors, nurses, researchers, medical students, and other health professionals. They demand the decision makers to take note of the latest scientific evidence on the health damage of air pollution as a basis for any future air quality policy. They have signed a manifesto for an urgent and sustainable action to tackle air pollution and to protect their patients and our environments. And this campaign is available online on medicsforcleanair.eu website, which you can also join if you're a healthcare professional and you can sign their manifesto. Now, we know that combustion engines are a major source of harmful pollutants, and current measures, unfortunately, do not go far or fast enough, burdening Europeans with worse health and greater costs. EPHA believes that the EU and member states should take a more proactive approach. We also believe that EU and member states should end investment in fossil or alternative fuels and commit to zero-emission electric vehicles. And last but not least, for a healthier and happier Europe, we must promote walking, cycling, and public transport as a norm. So it is not surprising that many others share our opinion, and that on June 8, 2022, the European Parliament, as Richard suggested, voted to stop the sale of new diesel and petrol road vehicles by 2035, and that just 2 days ago, the member states endorsed it. And the faster we make Europe the first diesel-free continent, the healthier air we will breathe. We do, however, still need solid evidence-based policy evidence to better understand its interlinkages with health. And this is exactly what the goal of the study conducted by CE Delft on fuel and drivetrain options for road transport and their impact on air pollution is all about, and what we will learn about today. And the study demonstrates that we need to move faster and accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. So I'm delighted to be here today and to be learning more from the experts. And I wish you all a very successful and joyful discussion. Over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Milka, thank you so much for that and for setting the scene for today's discussion. We really appreciate it. Before I introduce Anko to summarize the study being launched today, we have a special video. So we were due to have Sara Cerdas, MEP, with us today. Sara is a member of the European Parliament's Environment and Public Health Committee. Sadly, she had a last-minute scheduling conflict, as sometimes happens, but she was eager to contribute, especially about the legislative context of this study. And she sent us a video message that we would like to play for you now.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to being present, even though not physically in this event. I would like to thank the European Public Health Alliance for all the efforts to also guarantee my presence here, even though not live, as I'm partaking now in the discussions at the European Parliament in the Environment and Public Health Committee meeting, where we are discussing oceans, biodiversity and pesticides. So once again, thank you for having me here, and I'll focus my intervention on legislative proposals that we have been working and future solutions on fighting air pollution. So as you have known by now, I hope, we have been working very intensively here in the European Union on the Fit for 55 package. So this is the biggest legislative file ever negotiated at the same time, and it aims to draw our climate action in the EU. So what we aim here is to trigger a climate and energetic transition in order to achieve our climate neutrality goal of 2050 and our climate target reduction of at least 55% of our emissions by 2030 when we compare to 1990, as in accordance with the climate law. What do we have here? In the transport sector, we have that this sector heavily contributes to the overall emissions in the EU, and it represents 25% of all emissions in the EU. And cars and vans represent 15% of these emissions. So it is quite clear that this package and the Green Deal states that we need to decarbonize the sector by 90% until 2050. Why am I here speaking about transport and cars and vans? Because with all these proposals, there has been important impacts on reduction of air pollution, but I would like to speak to you today, this morning, on a particular proposal, which was the revision of the regulation of the CO2 emission standards for cars and vans. And we approved this regulation in the 8th of June, the Parliament's proposal. And it's something very dear to my heart because I was the negotiator for my political group. This was an unprecedented agreement because we were able to stick and maintain the final end date for internal combustion engines by 2035. What does this mean? That after 2035, every new car and van that will be sold in the market for the first time will be zero emissions from a tailpipe approach. And this means that majority of new cars will then be electric with the technology we have available right now, but also this proposal allows for the use of other technologies such as hydrogen and fuel cell cars. So can you just imagine the benefits this will bring to the health of everyone, for our citizens? It's a very important and positive legislation, and hence I also applaud the study that is being launched that confirms that switching to electric will save the EU billions of euros every year in health costs. If we would account for the health costs of many of the different policies, I can guarantee you that we would take much more a health in all policies approach in our legislation. So this is an important sign with this legislation that will represent an important change in our mobility, how we go from one side to the others, especially for consumers. And speaking about this regulation, we will also have another legislation here in the European Union, which is the revision of the air quality standards. Here I also aim for us to have a very strong position on the upcoming EU's laws on this regard and having them aligned with the World Health Organization WHO's new guidelines on air pollution. Because as you know, the data is quite frightening. Every year, the WHO estimates that there are 7 million premature deaths worldwide caused by air pollution. And in the EU, this represents around 300,000 premature deaths, according to the European Environmental Agency. Hence the importance of what I just referred before, health in all policies approach, where the health gains should always be included in the different pieces of legislation and impact assessment of every legislation we work on to ensure a multidisciplinary and holistic approach to climate change, to air pollution, and this fight on climate change, on air pollution, is also a health fight. Science should be our guiding light, and science has been telling us for years, especially more directly through the latest IPCC reports, that we must reduce our dependency on fossil fuels if we want to save the planet and limit the rise of temperatures to 1.5 degrees as agreed in the Paris Agreement. For this, we want the EU to lead by example, to lead our climate change fight, because fighting for climate change, better climate, it means that we are fighting for better health and well-being for all, guaranteeing a living planet for everyone in it. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I wish you a very good event.
I want to thank Sara for sharing that message with us. It was very generous of her, and I think in the spirit of what her message, that science should be our guiding light, that is very much the spirit in which we are meeting today. And with having said that, we're now going to hear about the study that we are launching today from the study's author. We'll hear from senior researcher with independent research agency CE Delft, Anko Hoon. Anko is a researcher in the field of environment and mobility. He's also the author of the earlier study that this is a follow-up to, which explored the external health costs from diesel road vehicles. And in this study, he looks at the best alternatives to diesel road vehicles. Anko, great to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, so thank you for the opportunity to tell something about the study we performed for EPHA on drivetrain options for road transport and the impacts on air pollution. If you could go to the next slide, please. As Richard also already mentioned, it is actually an extension of a study we performed for EPHA as well in 2018, which concluded that the cost of road traffic related air pollution in the EU 28 at that time was 67 to 8 billion euros in 2016, which would drop considerably until 2030, but would still remain considerable with an amount of 19.5 to 25.6 billion in 2030. So when we finished this study, we talked to EPHA and said what could be interesting follow-up research questions on this study. And we came up with the idea to look at fuel and drivetrain alternatives to replace diesel vehicles instead of just eliminating all diesel emissions as we did in the previous study. And of course, there are different options to phase out diesel or to replace diesel vehicles, such as vehicles running on natural gas, on liquid petroleum gas, semi-electric or full electric vehicles, and renewable fuels or biofuels. So we would look at the environmental benefits, both well to tank and tank to wheel. And we also opted to look at a broader range of external costs, whereas the first study looked at health costs, but there are also other external costs associated with road transport, such as noise, safety, and congestion. And we said it would be also interesting to look at the impacts on that. So next slide, please. So some of the key elements of the study, we focus on road transport, which is on passenger cars, vans, also called light commercial vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, buses and two-wheelers. They're all included in the study. We look again at the base year 2016, which is for reasons of comparison of the previous study. But we have updated it slightly with the most actual data. And we again look at predicted changes for the year 2030, as in the previous study. The scope is EU 27, and we also look at 9 individual member states, which I only graze upon in this presentation, but there is much information to be found in the study for those as well. And we chose or constructed 7 different fuel and technology scenarios. And then we look at the following impacts, which are shown in the table. Same as in the previous study, we look at nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. But we extend the scope by looking also to well-to-tank emissions, where previously we only looked at tank-to-wheel emissions. So the emissions from energy production is also included now in the study, and the external costs from that is also calculated. Well, if we look at external costs then on the right-hand side, we again look at the health impacts. And we have added a number of additional external costs, which are also associated with road transport, which are about safety or accidents, congestion, noise, as I already said, the well-to-tank emissions and also climate costs of CO2. So next slide, please. So shortly on the 7 technology or drivetrain scenarios we distinguish, we have looked at replacing diesel with natural gas, which is a mix of compressed gas, CNG, or liquid natural gas, depending on the vehicle type. The second scenario is about liquid petroleum gas, a fossil-based petroleum-like fuel. Then there's the third scenario, which is about a renewable fuel, which is hydrotreated vegetable oil or a diesel substitute, sometimes also referred to as drop-in fuel. We look in the fourth scenario at plug-in hybrid vehicles, semi-electric vehicles, which use a mix of electricity and petrol or diesel. And then we have the so-called E85 or ethanol scenario, which is a petrol substitute, and also a large share of renewable in that scenario. Then we have a scenario where we look at the impact of replacing all current diesel vehicles with the newest Euro standard version, Euro 6D, to replace the current diesel types. And then finally, we have the zero emission scenario where all diesel vehicles are replaced with full electric or 100% electricity vehicles. So we call them scenarios, but it's good to keep in mind that they are so-called what-if scenarios. So what we do is we illustrate what the maximum potential of diesel replacement would be, and they are not necessarily realistic scenarios, what could happen until 2030, but they do show you the impact, what would happen if all diesel would be replaced, and what the external cost reductions would be if that would be the case. So please keep that in mind, and then we can go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So some findings on the emission impacts. What we have seen that the NOx and PM emissions decrease by far the most by substituting diesel vehicles with full electric vehicles. We also see that plug-in hybrid and natural gas do the same, but to a much lesser extent. And we should also note that for natural gas particularly, there are some concerns on the emissions of ultrafine particles, which are not included specifically or explicitly in the study, but that is something to be aware of, and this is not accounted for in these tables. Then we have finally that diesel substitutes or biodiesel, although they are effective in reducing climate emissions, they are somewhat counterproductive if we look at reducing air quality. So if we go to the next slide, we have a bigger version of the table. And now we see on the right-hand side that if we go to the electricity full electric scenario, we see that the residual emissions of all these scenarios in all the countries and in the EU27 are zero when you go to a scenario with replacement of diesel vehicles by electricity or electric vehicles. And if you go to the next slide, next slide. Yes, sorry, thank you. No, the previous slide, yes, thanks. If we look at this slide, we see that indeed CNG or natural gas and plug-in hybrid also reduce emissions considerably from 100% to roughly 30 to 40%, but much less so than the full electric scenario. This is for NOx, but that is also consistent for PM and also for well-to-tank and tank-to-wheel emissions. So now we can go to the non-emission part, which is about the external costs. This is only air pollution. So that is comparable to the previous study we did. And what you see is that in the base year 2016, the external costs are accumulated to 63.8 billion euros, and they will drop in 2030 with existing policies to 14 billion euros. So that is a considerable drop in emissions due to emission standards already in place. But still, there is a considerable residual amount of external costs seen in 2030, which could be minimized or reduced further by the technology scenarios that we looked at. And if we then look at these technology scenarios in the right-hand side, the red box, we see that all the scenarios reduce, apart from the HVO scenario, the hydrotreated vegetable oil scenario, we see that all scenarios reduce emissions. And for electric vehicles, the electricity scenario, it is the highest with slightly over 70% reduction of external costs from air pollution. And this equals a reduction of 0 to 10 billion euros in 2030 compared to the baseline. Next slide, please. This is the external costs with the extended scope, so where we add additional factors of external costs also associated with road transport. On the left-hand side, the red squared box, you see again the 63.8 or rounded now 64 billion euros in the baseline in 2016. And then we have the drop to 14 billion euros with existing policies. But if we look at the right-hand side red box, we see that if we include external costs from well-to-tank pollution, air pollution, and well-to-tank CO2 emissions, accidents, noise, congestion, the external costs are way higher, a factor of 10, or over a factor of 10 higher than if we only look at air pollution. So if we can go to the next slide, what we see then is that if we look only at air pollution, the scenarios and the most beneficial scenario, which is zero emission vehicles, can lead to a maximum reduction of external costs of 10 billion euros in 2030 compared to the baseline. But if in the right-hand side we look at the extended scope of external costs, we see that a reduction of 45 billion euros is possible, which are also cost savings which benefit society, you can say, and which is additional to the benefits if you only look at health costs as we did in the previous study. So that you can say is a larger rationale for policy interventions to reduce the impacts of diesel vehicles and to reduce their use also. So to the final slide then, with the conclusions, we have seen that current policies will reduce external costs from air pollution substantially already due to policies in place, almost by 80% between now and 2030. But we can see also that we have shown that alternative fuels and drivetrains can add to that. And substituting diesel vehicles with zero emission vehicles is by far the most effective pathway to reduce the impact of air pollution and associated social costs. We have also seen that plug-in hybrid and natural gas substantially reduce the potential to reduce air pollution related to social costs. But as I said, there is some concern for natural gas with respect to the ultrafine particle emissions, and also the plug-in hybrid and natural gas are much less effective in reducing emissions than the zero emission pathway. And finally, we have seen that broadening the scope, I wasn't quite finished, thank you. Broadening the scope of external costs from road transport reveals a much larger potential for the reduction of external costs, and also maybe a larger rationale for policy intervention to limit the use of diesel vehicles. So that concludes my short presentation. There's much more to be found in the report itself, of course, and I would recommend you to read it as well. But if there are any questions at this stage, I will be happy to answer them. If that fits in the schedule, Richard, I'm not sure.
It absolutely does. Anko, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate that. Yes, we would love to take some questions from the audience on this study. So if you have any questions about this study, at the bottom of your Zoom window, you will see a Q&A, question and answer box where you can submit your questions to Anko, and you can submit questions throughout the session today, including for our panelists later on. Anko, it's a really interesting study, and certainly it paints a very clear picture about the external costs, savings that are potentially realizable by replacing diesel with electric vehicles. I suppose what I'd be interested to hear from you, this study is obviously a follow-up to the study you did in 2018. Looking at this study and looking back at the previous study, I'd be interested to hear what has most surprised you.
Well, it's not really surprising, because that was what we've seen already in the previous study, of course, that there is a big, how do you say, reduction of emissions possible already from existing policies. So that shows you the benefit of doing something about the exhaust emissions through legislation. So that is also a good sign to say we should maybe up the tempo to reduce emissions from diesel vehicles by introducing new Euro standards, and also the new legislation or decision, of course, about phasing out the fossil fuel vehicles is a good step in that direction. So I'd say that maybe the study in previous study helped somewhat to the discussion to phase out diesel, or at least phase out diesel emissions. And I think that is actually continued in this study. What is new, of course, is that we have shown that there's actually a bigger rationale for policy intervention if you look at a broader range of external costs, which also affect society. They are not directly health related, but of course safety, accidents, traffic accidents as well. They can also be quite impactful, as we have shown. And for that reason, there's also a reason to maybe reduce car use in cities where most safety issues take place, and look at a broader range of measures, also with active mobility, as was mentioned previously, by bicycling and walking, and replacing some of the road transport with these modes of transport.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We have a question from Raymond. Obviously, the car production itself carries a degree of emissions and air pollution in that process. But are you able to say anything about the impacts or emissions of building electronic vehicles versus conventional diesel or petrol vehicles? And especially, I think probably the batteries will be one of the main differences. Are you able to say anything about that from your study?
Not from our study, unfortunately. So we looked at the well-to-tank emissions, but that only includes the production of the fuels, or the energy carriers, as we call it, and not specifically the building or construction, and also demolition of the vehicle. So that is outside of the scope of the study. On average, you see that about 15 to 20% of all emissions, if you would take that into account, that section, it can be attributed to production and demolition of vehicles. But there's much discussion at this point, and also much uncertainty about the impacts of, let's say, scarce materials for the production of electric vehicles and batteries, particularly. That is something that is under investigation, and I cannot be really, let's say, clear about what the impacts would be on that. So that is something for further study.
Thank you, Anko. So one of the things that your study has looked at is compared to sort of the 2016 data, and looking at the overall reductions expected in external costs, basically as a result of the EU6 emission standards and the general change in fleet composition. So if we think about sort of the remaining diesel vehicles on our road, including the second-hand market, do you have an idea of when Europe may be a completely diesel-free continent without further intervention policy-wise?
Yeah, well, without additional policy, that will take quite some more time than the 2035 we have now agreed upon to ban, let's say, petrol and diesel sales, because people will drive their cars for approximately 10 to 15 years. Some of them may be exported to outside EU, but they will still impact, of course, health in other countries. So the diesel vehicles that are used are bought, let's say, in 2034, will still be used for a considerable time. So if we want to do something about that as well, I think we should try to maybe put some incentives in place that would discourage selling or buying diesel vehicles already prior to 2035 by making them, for example, more expensive, and make other alternatives like electric vehicles more attractive, maybe with prices. That would be an option, or maybe also some more restrictive measures such as zero emission zones, which could be implemented in cities, for example, so you cannot drive your diesel vehicle in a city anymore. But yeah, these are of course more the let's say you have the carrot and stick measures, more in the type of the stick perhaps, so that's maybe a bit controversial, but they would be effective, or could be effective, and should be considered if you want to phase out diesel use.
I'm sure some of those options we'll discuss in our upcoming panel discussion. I would thank Dragomira for submitting that question from the audience. We have another question, which is about your findings about NOx reductions for plug-in hybrids, and that there was a discussion, a suggestion from Pedro, that your study has indicated much higher NOx reductions compared to other studies. So could you talk a little bit about how you calculated these reductions?
Yes, well, we are quite familiar, let's say, with setting up database with all the literature which it says something about the emissions of vehicles. They are, of course, surrounded by a bandwidth and uncertainty. But what we have used is, let's say, a standardized or state-of-the-art set of emission factors for all types of vehicles, which we update quite regularly. And that was also a reason which we felt confident about performing this study for EPHA, because we already have a good basis of all this information. So it's difficult for me to respond on if there's a particular study which gives higher emissions. I trust that that there is probably such a study, but there could be some circumstances why these emissions are higher. That's difficult to comment on this stage. I would be happy to look at that in some more detail, maybe separately from this session. But I'm quite confident that the emission factors we use in this study, that they are state of the art and that they represent what is used in the scientific community and are in that sense not off mark, let's say.
That's great. Anko, I think we have time for 2 more quick questions. So firstly, one of the things that your study highlighted is the potential external cost reductions for hydrotreated vegetable oil. And the potential external cost reduction for HVO, you will estimate to be around 41 billion compared to electric vehicles, which is 45 billion. But one of the things you mentioned in your study is about the land use necessary to make that fuel and the potential implications that has on all sorts of things, including climate change and food prices and feedstock. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's not really my area of expertise, but indeed we did say something about that in the study. We did not look in detail at the land use issue, but of course, always when you use, let's say, renewable energy and from renewable sources, there might be an issue with food competition. This is for hydrotreated vegetable oil. There are let's say standards, criteria, how these fuels should be produced, which sort of eliminates partly the risk you just mentioned, but it can never be eliminated fully. So that is definitely a concern that should be noted when looking at replacing fossil fuels with these types of fuels. There can be trade-offs, let's say, with other issues which are outside the transport sector, let's say, and indeed food competition and also additional emissions from indirect land use. These are issues that always make the discussion about renewable fuels a bit more complicated than, for example, looking at the use of electricity.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think one final question. So very clearly from your study, there is basically one alternative that we should select that in terms of that is most likely to reduce emissions and therefore have the largest impact on external costs, which is to move to zero emission electric vehicles. Who do you think would most value from hearing what this study has to say?
Well, I hope it would be the policymakers, and that's always already what we look at in our studies. So sort of our mission is also to do research, but also to find ways to do effective policies which benefit in the end society, of course. But there's also always a role of public governments, local or national, that can decide to implement certain measures. And what we did here, I think, is provide, let's say, proof or rationale why it would be beneficial to reduce emissions from diesel. That would actually benefit society. So if you would do that by all kinds of measures, either strict or less strict, that would benefit society. And I hope that is sort of an argument for the policymakers to, or it provides them with an argument to say, okay, look, people, it's good to do something about diesel emissions and maybe on road transport, because in the end it's good for society. That is something that we have illustrated or demonstrated, I hope, by doing this study.
Anko, I think that's a great segue into to introduce our panelists. Anko, thank you for presenting this study and for answering questions from our audience. I hope you can stick around for our panel discussion, as I'm sure there's lots more that we could talk about. But for now, I would like to bring in our other panelists. So I'd like to introduce our panelists one at a time. We want to give them a few minutes to share their thoughts and their insights for our discussion today, and then we will take some questions. So please submit any questions you have for the panel using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we would love to hear them. So first up, I would like to introduce Professor Sara Andersson. Sara is a professor in environmental epidemiology with the Department of Public Health at the University of Copenhagen, where she specializes in health consequences of short and long-term exposure to air pollution. She is also chair of the Environment and Health Committee for the European Respiratory Society. Professor Andersson, it's great to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this very nice presentation of the new report, very important findings. As we acknowledge the health effects of traffic-related air pollution, I think it's a very positive that we look in such a systematic way as you provide here. What are the alternatives that will protect our health in a best possible way? So we'll just like to make several remarks as a response to this report. First, as it has been stating, health effects of air pollution are non-arguably one of the most important environmental impact on our health today. It has been mentioned that we have these 7 million deaths globally attributed to air pollution, over 300,000 deaths in Europe. But I just want to mention that recently we had released just last year of WHO new air quality guidelines, which is a huge document that reviews all the newest knowledge on health effects of air pollution, and some very important results came out of this document. The document has recommended much lower values of air pollution in order to protect health. So we pretty much concluded that there is no lower values of air pollution. There's no lower threshold, that we are all really, at European context and globally, exposed to air pollution that is dangerous for us. This also exposes the fact that current legislation is really not protecting us. There's even bigger gap in what science tells us is dangerous for our health, and these guidelines that are based on, and what we have currently in Europe. So there's definitely room for improvement. And these WHO new air quality guidelines, as mentioned earlier, have really initiated this huge legislative process around air quality standards in EU that are currently under revision. So this is a very important policy on air pollution that we really hope, as a scientific community, we endorse full alignment of new air quality guidelines with standards, with WHO guidelines for how low we need to go. Another important message that came out in new WHO air quality guidelines is that the health effects of air pollution are actually even stronger and broader than what we knew some years ago. And even these numbers that were thrown out today, about more than 300,000 deaths in EU due to air pollution, are based on some old estimates. So right now, European Commission is working on a health impact assessment, and those numbers will be based on these updated numbers that came out of WHO report. We have just last 2-3 years, some really high quality new European studies on health effects of air pollution that show us that health effects are even stronger. This is because we have better way to assess air pollution. We have better cohorts, better register data. So basically, all these estimates and the health estimates based on this report are underestimated to what we know, what is the newest knowledge. So the number of deaths due to air pollution is higher, and these numbers will increase in the new health impact assessment by European Environmental Agency in future. They will use this updated number. So just to point out that also these numbers are huge, they're still underestimate of real burden of air pollution. Besides the number of deaths, we also have to be reminded these health impact assessments do not account for all the morbidity outcomes, for all those number of people that are daily suffering from respiratory conditions, from asthma, COPD in elderly, to increased risk of infections such as pneumonias, respiratory infections, children and elderly, COVID-19. We have fast emerging evidence on the links between air pollution and COVID-19 infections, which is really important to take into the discussions. We know that air pollution is carcinogenic. We have increased number of studies showing that air pollution affects not just lung cancer, but a number of other cancers that we didn't know so much about earlier. We know that air pollution causes cardiovascular disease, and this is main contributor to this number of deaths from air pollution. This is really cardiovascular impact. Newest evidence disturbingly shows that air pollution affects our brain, our ability to cognitively fully use our mind, our IQ, already from childhood, affecting cognitive development in children, but also increased risk of dementia. And some of the newest evidence also points to the link between mental health and air pollution, which is also something that affects many Europeans during entire lifetime. So air pollution and all this, just to be right, this is all about health, and still we are mapping new diseases, and the air pollution burden on health is larger than we even now presented in these numbers. Another point to bring out, I'm very happy that report pointed out of some additional parameters. It's not just air pollution when we talk traffic and diesel cars, but noise as well, congestion, climate change, and CO2 emissions and greenhouse emissions. And again, noise impact on health is also something that's been studied more recently, but it's likely to increase. We know now about the link with cardiovascular disease, but likely there's impact on metabolic diseases as well as on our brain health. So this is also likely to add even more to cost than we currently know. And so very important right now with climate change, this unprecedented impact of climate change on health, which we don't know so well. There's such a complex way that climate change will impact our health also via air pollution, is also very important to take into account. And I'm glad the report has mentioned these issues. So, and finally, to conclude, and I think it's been said by earlier that we fully support the conclusions of this report, that way forward is replacement by zero emission, and this is clearly from report fully electric vehicles, and this is great knowledge to bring about. We support it, but this is not the only way forward. We also need to heavily support policies in the cities, in countries that support reduction in use of cars and motor vehicles. We still have non-tailpipe emissions, as the report mentioned, abrasion from road, the metals in PM that come from brake wear, from tires, from asphalt abrasion. They impact also our health. We don't know enough yet how much is from exhaust, how much is from non-tailpipe emissions, and there will be more research brought forward to help us understand how these side products of motorized vehicles affect our health. So we'll need also to reduce traffic in our cities for our climate, for our own health, for more sustainable living in the cities, to tackle congestion, traffic safety. So just to mention that apart from our full support for the report that zero emission vehicles are way forward, replacing diesel, we also need to work on our cities to reduce use of cars, replace them with good public transport networks, with sidewalks, with biking paths. This will bring about better health in our citizens by making them walk more, bike more, get more outside, but also provide for more sustainable, livable, more pleasant cities to live in, and help us mitigate climate change effects along with air pollution effects. And with this, I will conclude my remarks for now.
Professor Anderson, thank you so much for that. Really striking to hear that it's likely that we are underestimating the number of premature deaths from air pollution, and that only emphasizing the need for healthier societies beyond simply just reducing emissions as a single approach to this. If you have any questions for Professor Anderson or for any of our panelists, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Professor Anderson, thank you very much. We will come back to you in a moment, I'm sure. For now, I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is Anna Krzyńska. Anna is an emissions engineer with the organization Transport and Environment, and her work focuses on testing car and van pollution, as well as the upcoming EU7 emission standards. Anna, it's great to have you here today, and I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard and EPHA, for having me here. So as has already been mentioned, air pollution kills hundreds of thousands of people across Europe every year. And we really have to start treating it as the health crisis that it is. This fantastic new study from EPHA clearly shows that electromobility is the best substitute for the current polluting vehicles that we have on the road. And therefore, for the sake of people's health, we really need to accelerate the transition to electromobility alongside increases in active travel and public transport. Therefore, it's incredibly encouraging that the 3 EU institutions now endorse the 2035 phase-out date for fossil fuel cars. However, what is concerning is that the proposal that has come out of the council, which could potentially allow e-fuels to be used in cars in the future. This is a diversion to try and keep the internal combustion engine, which is polluting, alive. We know that e-fuels are inefficient, expensive, and still produce as much pollution as fossil fuels. And therefore, this is simply a false solution. We need to stop wasting our time on e-fuels for cars and focus on rolling out charging infrastructure, reskilling workers for the e-mobility transition, and on responsibly sourcing materials for batteries. This is really critical. I'd quickly like to also touch on the issue of HVO fuels, as has already been mentioned in relation to food prices and land use changes. What we know is that HVO is simply not a sustainable fuel for transport, that is no better and actually worse for the climate due to the indirect land use changes associated compared to fossil fuels. After 10 years of the EU's biofuels policies, we have wiped out forests the size of the Netherlands. And there is simply just no way we can produce enough biofuels to fuel cars in Europe. What also has to be stated is that large amounts of vegetable oils, such as palm, are used in road transport. For palm, 50% of the oil imported to Europe is essentially burnt, goes up in smoke in cars. This is really bad for the current food crisis that people are experiencing. Vegetable oil prices have gone up by 2.5 times since 2020. And that could potentially push millions of people across the world into food poverty. Already, Indonesia has stopped the export of palm oil temporarily to try and stabilize prices. So not only are the current levels of vegetable oil use in transport for fuels unsustainable, there is simply no way we can increase that. So it's definitely clear that electromobility is the way forward. Another very important piece of legislation for accelerating electromobility is the legislative proposal for increasing the share of zero-emission vehicles in public and corporate fleets, which was announced as part of the Repower EU strategy last month. More than half of new cars in Europe are sold to fleets, meaning that this legislation has great potential to further accelerate the e-mobility transition on top of the car CO2 standards. These cars that are sold to fleets are usually sold after 2 or 3 years, so they're a great source of affordable second-hand cars to make e-mobility more accessible for all. In our opinion, to be effective, the proposal should, as a minimum, aim for 50% of fleet vehicles to be zero emission in 2025 and 100% in 2030. Now, as is already almost a year, we know that even with the increased electromobility transition, we're still going to sell about 100 million cars that have an internal combustion engine in between 2025 and 2035. So it's really important that the Commission publishes those proposals to reduce pollution from internal combustion engines as soon as possible, because we simply cannot afford to have another 100 million grossly polluting cars sold on and put on the EU's roads, which will stay there for decades. So legislators have the opportunity to take action to reduce pollution, and they have to take those steps now for the sake of people's health and the environment. Thank you.
Anna, thank you so much for sharing your insights, and really interesting to highlight, especially about as we pursue zero-emission electric vehicles, we still have the responsibility to responsibly source materials for those vehicles, including responsibly sourcing the materials for batteries. It's a really helpful contribution, especially about hydro-treated vegetable oil as well, and the oil market in general. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. If you have questions for Anna, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. But for now, Anna, thank you very much. And I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is Ian Catlow. So Ian is the head of London's European office, where for the past 15 years, he's been involved in representing the Mayor of London and Transport for London across Europe. With transport being a substantial part of his role, he is also the chair of the Eurocities Working Group on Zero Emission Mobility. Ian, it's wonderful to have you with us today, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard, and thank you to EPHA for the invitation to take part this morning. And as you said, I'm doing that both on behalf of London and on behalf of the Eurocities network, which represents all the major cities in Europe. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that Europe's big cities are committed to facilitating electrification of the vehicle fleet. And of course, this is for a variety of reasons. It's essential for combating climate change and also for reducing the health impacts of poor air quality. And as other people have said, it's also about making our cities better places to live and increasing the quality of life for people who live and work and visit there. So I mean, as public administrations, it's extremely important to us that we have the latest data and analysis on the impacts of changes in vehicle technology and in use. So of course we very much welcome the EPHA study being published today, and of course this suggests that a commitment to vehicle electrification is the right approach, and so that's quite reassuring. But of course in cities, we can't do these things in isolation. I think there's a consensus amongst the major cities in favour of modal shift away from individual vehicle use towards public transport and walking and cycling. And this is really not about ideology. I mean, the population of cities is still growing very fast. Space is limited in urban areas, and we have to manage that space more actively now. And of course, congestion is still a very major cost to the economy. There is literally no room for more vehicle traffic in cities. But in any case, our broader public policy objectives related to environment and health and social fairness can't be achieved without a move towards a different model of mobility in cities. I mean, we believe that the only way to make progress is through an integrated approach to managing urban mobility. So cities, in our view, should be developing sustainable urban mobility plans, as we call them, or equivalent strategies. And the European Commission is supporting this. Eurocities helps to support that. And of course, in some cases, it's actually an obligation under national law for cities to produce these plans. So, as I say, we're reassured by the findings of the study. I think we know what kind of approach we should be taking to support electrification of the vehicle fleet. But there's still a long way to go. There are many challenges in the implementation of these plans. It requires a change in behaviour by citizens, and it requires a change in culture by public administrations, by vehicle manufacturers, the energy sector, by business users, and everybody else. So yeah, I think we're beginning to get on the right track, but there's still a lot of barriers to overcome, and a long way to go before we can say that we've really achieved what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. Yes, I think it's important to appreciate the scale of the challenge, and then indeed cities don't exist in isolation, and they are part of an integrated solution to this issue. Ian, thank you very much. So if you have any questions for Ian or our other panelists, please submit them using the question function below. But for now, I would like to introduce our final panelist, who is Onuf Karon. Onuf has been working in the energy sector for 20 years. with the past 12 as the director of ELAD. ELAD are a knowledge and innovation center for smart charging infrastructure in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has the largest number of electric car charging points in the EU, and ELAD works with grid operators to prepare for future electric mobility and sustainable charging. He is also a member of the Dutch government's working group on vehicle charging infrastructure. Olaf, it's really wonderful to have you here with us today. I'll hand the floor to you. And if you could unmute, that'd be very helpful.
Yes, I hope you can hear me now. Thank you for having me, Richard. Maybe indeed from a different perspective, some remarks on the study so as you said, ELAD is not only working together with the grid operators, but it's actually founded by the grid operators in 2009 to study the impact of EVs on the grid. And I think a prerequisite for success for a successful transition to electric vehicles is for sure a good infrastructure, and that means a good infrastructure, a good grid. And we see in Holland that although the number of EVs is increasing rapidly, although the policies to assure that, like zero emission zones, etc., already mentioned by a few of the panel members, are in place, there are still so many other challenges that might be a barrier for the successful transition to electrification. And a good infrastructure is certainly one of them. With regard to that, e-mobility has to compete, as it were, with the other components of the energy transition, being it solar or wind, or as we have in Holland, a program to get rid of the natural gas for housewarming. So we have a very big electrification wave going on because of the energy transition, and e-mobility is competing on that level with other transitions. So to assure that the electrification of mobility is going according to plan, we have to come up with a number of things, I guess, in a European perspective. That is a good regulatory framework that assures governments to invest in infrastructure and do that in a uniform way, in a way that we have open markets, so that the market for electromobility can grow rapidly. If we do so, then I'm pretty sure that things will actually go a lot faster than they are projected. We are, as ELAD, we do studies as well on the trend and the growth of EVs, being it cars or buses or trucks. But each time we are surprised by the rapid, the fast, that it's moving faster than we have projected. Only yesterday, our Minister of Infrastructure said, and Anna, that is with regard to fleet owners. Only yesterday, our Ministry of Transport said that they will mandate that as of 2025, new business cars for fleet owners have to be zero emission. So that is to say, that is electrified. So again and again, it goes faster than we project. And I think that with regard to the study, that's good. But if we do not invest in infrastructure as we should, then it will be a barrier and an argument for the car industry to keep on driving fossil fuel cars. Thank you for now.
Olaf, I think it's a really valuable contribution. Thank you. And certainly the Netherlands is one of the leading nations on this, but it does highlight the point that there is a high degree of difference across the EU 27 with some countries moving ahead with infrastructure a lot faster than others, and other countries with their fleet composition having more diesel vehicles among them than others. I think it's a really valuable contribution, Onuf. Thank you. If you have any questions for Onuf and our other panelists, now is the moment. So please submit them using the question box below. We have about 20 minutes for a discussion among our panelists. And I think a good place to begin would be to explore some of the elements around exactly what the problem is. So we're very grateful to be joined today by MQ Mental Health, a charity that funds mental health research, who supported a study with King's College London that found that exposure to air pollution in formative years increases the risk of psychosis in later life. Professor Anderson, you mentioned the mental health impacts of air pollution as being one of the elements to consider. It's a topic that's not often discussed. Would you be able to share a little bit more about that?
Yes, very much. So this is emerging topic really within health research on air pollution health effects. So we have several quite convincing studies on air pollution and onset of depression. Those are some of the early research of air pollution, health effects, impact on mental health. Psychosis study is one of the new ones, I think, is mentioned from London. I'm aware of the studies. This is very interesting finding as well, with nice clinical data on this outcome, which confirms this overall effect. We have also recently conducted a large study on European population, a lab study where we looked at air pollution and all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, respiratory lung cancer mortality that have been well established. We also took a look in mortality from psychiatric disorders, and we also found a strong association. This is hopefully about to be published. So I believe this is really a real effect, quite disturbing one, because as we say, mental health issues affect population of Europe. I think there are numbers about 25 to 30% of Europeans are affected by some mental health issues during their lifetime, and a lot of younger people are affected. And so it will be very interesting to move research in this area forward and see exactly what is the overall impact of air pollution on the brain. This goes well along on our understanding that air pollution effect in the brain, the neuroinflammation in the brain, the oxidative distress that impacts blood vessels in our brain, the neurons, that kind of inflammation that, as I already mentioned, impacts our risk of dementia and affects our cognitive function, that can also impact our emotional health, is also, it's biologically plausible. So again, we find this interesting, disturbing, because of course, apart from somatic diseases, mental health issues are also present a huge burden, increasing burden in European populations. So we very much look forward to see how research develops, but for sure we'll be seeing more of these studies. So these are real effects, and as I said, seem as strong as we've seen with cardiovascular health, lung cancer, and other outcomes we know very well of.
Thank you. Anko, I'd be interested to hear from the perspective of your study. You've estimated the potential health savings from tank to wheel emissions if you replace all diesel with electric vehicles would be somewhere in the region of 9.1 billion euros per year across the whole EU27. Were those health cost estimates, are they mostly physical health, or did that also include a mental health cost estimate?
They were mostly physical health, yeah. We try to update, of course, these figures on external costs with the most recent research, but there's always a lag because new things arise, as Professor just mentioned. So it's mostly non-mental health-related costs, but physical health costs, which are included in these numbers, yes.
Thank you. That's a really helpful clarification, and it shows that I think with every new complexity that we introduce to the study, it actually it's only emphasizing the even more potential savings and potential benefits of moving away from diesel emissions. Speaking of, we have a question from Paolo that I think would be great for Anna to answer. Paolo was asking about NOx emissions, about their toxicity, and whether they are more representative of a mix of noxious substances emitted from diesel combustion? And really, is there a viable solution which would be simply to trap NOx emissions in order to reduce the toxicity of diesel emissions?
Thank you very much, Richard. So we know that from internal combustion engines, both diesel and petrol, we have a mixture of called NOx being emitted out of the tailpipe. So that's both nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide. Nitrogen dioxide is the very toxic gas that causes all the health effects, but it has to be noted that in the air, nitrogen oxide is also converted to nitrogen dioxide, and both of those gases also contribute to PM pollution as well when mixed with other compounds in the air. So this is why in the emission standards that we have, it is both nitrogen dioxide and oxide that are regulated as part of a NOx standard. Now, we do have a network of air quality monitoring stations across Europe. We know that NOx pollution is the worst on congested roads, especially in cities. But really, the most effective way is to reduce the concentrations of nitrogen dioxide in the air, is to reduce it at the source. And in Europe, the primary source of nitrogen dioxide is transport. So really, we need to reduce that, and the most effective way is to just move to e-mobility along with active forms of transport. And that has to come with, unfortunately, we're not moving to e-mobility straight away. We still have probably another 100 million cars on the road that will be put on the road before the complete phase out. They will stay on the road for decades, especially in Eastern Europe, where the lifetime of vehicles can be in excess of 20 years. So really, we have to get new standards in place for those engines to bring down those NOx pollution levels as low as possible. They already have tighter standards set in China and the USA. It's now time for the EU to take action as well.
Anna, thank you so much for that answer. That's a really helpful summary of the overall complexity of NOx emissions and how that's assessed. Thank you for that. It does lead nicely into where some of the bottlenecks, where some of the choke points are, which is really on congested roads. And I think, Ian, your contribution here as someone who talks about cities and mobility in cities, I think will be really valuable here. We have a question from Dragomira, who's asking about what role you see there are for zero emission zones in cities as part of the ways that we can accelerate the move away from the internal combustion engine towards zero emission electric vehicles. And indeed, do they have a role to play in doing that before 2035?
Thanks. Well, this is a good question, and it's certainly the case that cities are not just sort of sitting and waiting around for national or EU level regulation to sort out the problem. And for many years now, cities have been experimenting with congestion charges or with low emission zones and other kind of road restrictions, precisely to try and speed up the transition to a more sustainable mobility model. So this is absolutely part of the plan. I mean, in London, we now have an ultra low emission zone which covers half of the city, covering 4 million people, where the minimum standards for emissions are Euro 6 for diesel and Euro 4 for petrol. And many other cities are trying to do the same thing. Oslo, of course, has explicit plans for a zero emission zone in the city centre. In Brussels here, again, city centre roads are now pedestrianised. Paris, the plans in Paris, which are very impressive. I mean, imply phasing out of diesel vehicles, in the next 2 or 3 years. And I was in Paris recently, and if you look at the rollout of the cycling infrastructure there, I mean, it's very impressive. and this is a very clear signal to people in Paris that they have to change the way they behave, and obviously we would prefer that people change their behaviour because they see the case for that and because they're encouraged to do that, rather than just banning things or closing roads. But obviously there was there's an element of carrot and stick about all the strategies. So the answer is yes. We're doing our best to force the agenda and to make the changes certainly ahead of national or European level legislation. But we need that support from Europe and from them and from national governments as well. That's for sure.
Ian, thank you for that. I think you raise a really interesting question about behaviour change. And this is a question I'd like to throw to all of the panelists, which is really, how would you describe the behaviour change that is needed? And especially, what do you think is needed to influence different transport choices for the population itself? Who would like to contribute on that point?
Well, maybe I'll start. Just from a Dutch perspective, I must say, and from the point of view that what's been happening in Holland, in the Netherlands so far. I think the last 10 years of EV in Holland have shown that a part of the behavior change is through the wallet of the customer or the wallet of the entrepreneur. The electrification of trucks is on its way. But a main driver is the TCO, what the total cost of ownership is for the industry. We had a subsidy scheme only a month ago for truck drivers for electrification, some 25 or 30 million euros, I guess. And within a day, it was overdrawn. So if there is a financial incentive, things go very, very, very fast. Some other remarks with regard to that is that I am in a steering committee on a government level. And what we see there is that the transition from fossil fuels to electrification is also hurting the financial basis of the government. That is to say, tax income on fossil fuels has to be transformed to some kind of taxation on electric vehicles. And I think that is not a very sustainable way of doing so. I think, as Anko said, there are more profits on a health level that could be taken into account, and could be maybe those profits could be transferred to the financial to the taxation level, as it were, of the electric vehicles. That would help a lot, and that is actually not helping in Holland. That's a discussion that's been going on, and I think it's an unfair discussion, and I think we should change that, and preferably on a European level, I think.
Thank you, Arnulf. Would any of our other panelists like to talk about potential behaviour changes? Professor Anderson.
Yes, thank you very much. I think those were some very important comments from the previous panelists on, I think we lagged a little bit in our evaluation of income or cost, or the cost-benefit analysis to incorporate real health of cost or real benefits of reducing those costs. I think we need to talk more about cost of inaction than those costs. And I think this is a really good example. EU is right now taking on a cost-benefit analysis of implementing different scenarios for new air quality standards. So it's going to be very exciting what comes out of that. But I think definitely that shift of loss of income due to taxation versus health gains in savings to health sector have not been taking the entire cost of health. And I think we need to improve that valuation and full cost-benefit analysis. Also, there have been some interesting studies replacing some trips due to car, moving people, even just few percent of population, to walking, to cycling instead of sitting in a car, brings about enormous benefit in increased physical activity to health and reducing health costs. So that's also usually not taken into account, an indirect effect or reduction and switching cars to active transfer to health is often overseen. So there's a lot of way to improve this cost-benefit analysis, and I think that must be done so. A comment on the change, I think, of course, this discussion has been, it's been a difficult one. I think there's a initial resistance to change. There's a lot of talks about inequality, that the poorest one will be affected if they need to replace their car and so on. But we've seen in the cities in Holland, in cities in Copenhagen, the cities that have achieved those massive numbers of people cycling or switching to public health, or initiatives such as congestion charge or closing some roads to traffic and opening them up for pedestrian traffic to greening and so on. The final output of the change is something citizens welcome and support. So I think it's maybe, I don't know how we can encourage cities to show these good examples. I mean, these are the cities that are more livable, that are more pleasant. So I think it's the change that we initially resist, but if we look at an outcome, what cities achieve with these changes, that the citizens at the end of the change, of course, like to live in a cities where they have alternatives to just car traffic, that can jump on a car, on their bike and feel safe and have alternatives and nice pedestrian rails. And something in Copenhagen is a green cycling pathways, taking biking paths away from the traffic busy roads to reduce their pollution and noise exposure and so on. So I think there's plenty of examples of cities that have been successful in countries as Holland and Denmark, where I sit. And the cities that are implementing changes, as Paris and a lot of cities around Europe, to encourage, to show citizens that these changes at the end benefit themselves and our cities, and this overall fight against climate change effects on our health and air pollution. So those are a few of my comments. So there's both encouragement, some, of course, we have to follow by some legislation and simply increase the price of the polluting fuels, that we cannot avoid that. That brings fastest change that we must take with known cost due to air pollution and climate change that we haven't talked so much about. But also helping cities show some good examples that at the end, the citizens and everybody benefits from these changes cities have to take on.
Thank you. I think it's raised an interesting point about it's not just the stick, it is also the carrot and the move away. Before I have one final question for on-off, Ian, did you want to contribute on that question about behaviour change?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a very complex area, and we have to try and identify all the barriers and address them one by one. I mean, and just to take two examples, which maybe are opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, as part of our in London, as part of our electric vehicle infrastructure strategy, we're trying to make land available for charging points to be installed, because this in itself is a barrier. Where do you put them, and how do you get the permissions to install them, and who pays for it? And is there a business model, or a business case for actually having something there? And if there isn't, can we support that from the public sector in some way? So, we have to address all those issues in our infrastructure strategy, and that means we have to talk to the market and talk to other regulators to try and facilitate the installation of the charging points. So that's one sort of practical thing we can do at one end, but at the other end, in London, there are, we working for the Mayor and Transport for London, we're the strategic authority, but there are 33 boroughs in London, and they're much closer to the day-by-day concerns of citizens. And I know of one borough in outer London which, got a few electric bikes and started just giving them to local businesses for a few months just to try them out. And this has actually been very successful. Because unless you actually give the opportunity for people to try these things, they may not take that decision themselves. And as a result, a number of businesses in that particular borough have now started to provide electric bikes for their own employees, or the employees just liked using them and have bought them themselves. So we've got to address the sort of the very micro level as well as the sort of strategic problems, if you see what I mean.
I think it's a really valuable point, and I think that leads very nicely onto a question that we've received for on-off, which is, there's obviously electric cars, but we're also increasingly seeing other forms of transport that are being electrified, including electric bikes. and bicycles, and whether that infrastructure to support the public charging of electric bicycles, to what extent is that infrastructure being factored in? Is it being planned? To what extent is that sort of infrastructure being supported at the EU level? Onof, you may be able to share.
I'm not quite sure what's happening on a European level, but I'm pretty sure that in Holland, from a grid perspective, we are not having a special program on that. And from the government level, the National Agenda Infrastructure, which is the program to electrify transport in Holland, has no specific priority for bicycling. That is to say, it is already, I think, at the moment, most bikes that are sold are e-bikes. So there is not really an issue in Holland. And as you know, in Holland, there are more bikes than people in Holland. So the electrification there is not really an issue, I must say, and for sure not from a grid perspective, because it's the grid can cope with the bicycles without a problem. But it's the electrification mainly for cars, the number of cars that are in the housing areas, and it's the electrification for logistic transport. That's the main the main problem, as Ian said, with regard to infrastructure, with regard to having a plot to work. The market, the business model, that's all very recognizable and similar in Holland, I must say. So no particular program for electric bikes.
Interesting. That's an interesting perspective, considering how widely it's recognised that the move to walking, cycling, and public transport is definitely part of the mix for a healthier society. Sure. And indeed, whether it's public. Thank you very much. So I really want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions today. We're coming towards the end of our session, but I really want to thank everybody for their time and their insights today. I've greatly enjoyed this discussion, and I hope the rest of you have too. What we've heard today is another reminder about how harmful diesel emissions are for our health. And that the study that we launched today has shown us that faster replacement of diesel road vehicles with alternatives has the potential to save the EU countries billions of euros every year. And it's also shown that while plug-in hybrid, natural gas or biofuels, while they can reduce emissions, there really is no alternative that reduces emissions or is better for public health than zero-emission electric vehicles. So as we're wrapping up today, as we said earlier, you can follow the future developments related to this area by staying in touch with EPHA. So the recording of today's event will be available soon on EPHA's YouTube channel and on EPHA's website. And you can find the full version of the CE Delft study and all of EPHA's other work to improve public health and reduce health inequalities on EPHA's website, as well as on their Twitter and their LinkedIn channels. So with that, we will begin to bring our event to a close. I want to especially thank the team at EPHA. They have put a lot of hard work to make sure that today happens and to ensure that the study was launched in a timely way. And I especially want to thank our excellent speakers. I want to thank Dr. Milka Sokolović. I want to thank Anko Hohn, Professor Zorana Anderson, Ian Catlow, Anna Krajinska, Onof Caron, and I want to thank the video contribution from Sara Cerdas, MEP. I would also like to thank you for joining us today in the audience. Your questions helped us explore this topic even deeper, and we really appreciate you being with us. So we're looking forward to perhaps seeing you all again at one of EPHA's future events. But for now, thank you very much for your time today. We hope that you will share some of the messages and the study with your audiences and with your partners, and we greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.